Colorado Territory, 1873. The stagecoach kicked up dust that swirled like golden phantoms in the late afternoon sun. Zane Sutton leaned against the weathered post outside Timber Creek's lone general store, hat tipped down against the glare. At 25, he'd already seen enough of the West to know one truth: a man survived alone. The company of others, especially a woman, was nothing but a distraction that could get you killed in a land where death lurked behind every canyon wall and in every stranger's eyes. He adjusted his gun belt, the leather worn smooth from years of constant wear. 3 seasons working as a ranch hand at the Flying M had earned him enough to put a down payment on his own plot, 100 acres with a creek running through good grazing land. It wasn't much, but it was his. Alone was safer. Alone meant no one to disappoint, no one to lose, no one to mourn. "Stage is coming," called old Jenkins from his rocking chair. "Right on time for once." Zane nodded but didn't move. He had no reason to care about the stagecoach or its passengers. He was in town only to pick up supplies and would be back to his solitary cabin before nightfall, just as he preferred it. The stagecoach rolled to a stop, wheels creaking under the weight of its journey. The driver hopped down, stretching his back with audible pops before moving to open the door. Zane was about to turn away when someone, caught his eye. First came a gloved hand, delicate but firm as it gripped the iron rail. Then emerged a woman unlike any he'd seen in this dusty corner of the territory. She wore a blue traveling dress, tailored but practical, the color matching the clear mountain sky. Her honey blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, though a few strands had escaped to frame a face that spoke of both gentle breeding and quiet determination. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with eyes that surveyed the town with intelligence rather than fear. Something inside Zane shifted uncomfortably, like a horse sensing a storm. The woman hesitated at the top of the stagecoach steps. Zane didn't realize he'd moved until he was standing before her, hand extended upward. "Ma'am," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. She looked down at him, surprise flickering across features too fine for this rough country. "Thank you," she replied, placing her hand in his. As she stepped down, her foot caught on her hem. She pitched forward with a small gasp, and Zane found himself catching her, his arms encircling her waist with instinctive protectiveness. Time seemed to stop as he held her, feeling the warmth of another human being after so many months of isolation. "You're mine now," the cowboy whispered as she stepped off the stagecoach into his arms, the words escaping before he could trap them behind his teeth. They were presumptuous, forward, completely inappropriate, and yet they felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said. Her eyes widened, a blush coloring her cheeks as she steadied herself against his chest. "I beg your pardon." Zane felt heat crawl up his neck. "I meant, you're fine now. Safe. On solid ground." He released her and stepped back, touching the brim of his hat. "Zane Sutton, ma'am." "Faith Harrington," she replied, studying him with cautious interest. "I'm looking for Mr. Jenkins. I've been hired as the new schoolteacher." Jenkins rose from his chair with a creaking that mirrored the stagecoach. "That'd be me, Miss Harrington, Board of Education President, at your service." He grinned, toothlessly. "I see you've met young Sutton here. Keeps to himself, that one. Got it in his head that the frontier's no place for company." Faith's gaze returned to Zane, and he felt uncomfortably exposed. "Is that so, Mr. Sutton? What a lonely philosophy." "It's kept me alive," he replied flatly. "But is merely staying alive really living?" she asked, her voice gentle but challenging. The question hit him like a physical blow. Before he could formulate a response, Jenkins ushered her toward the boarding house, leaving Zane staring after them. He tried to shake off the encounter as he collected his supplies, but Faith Harrington's words echoed in his mind. By the time he mounted his horse for the ride home, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in fiery hues that reminded him of the determination in her eyes. His cabin seemed emptier than usual that night. 2 weeks later, Zane discovered his solitude had become infected with thoughts of Faith Harrington. He'd managed to avoid town since their first meeting, but drought had withered his garden, forcing him back to the general store for supplies. He timed his visit for when school would be in session, hoping to avoid her. The plan worked until he emerged from the store to find chaos in the street. A team of horses had broken free from their wagon and were charging down the main road. directly toward a small blonde figure crossing with an armful of books. Faith froze as the horses thundered toward her. Without thought, Zane dropped his supplies and ran. He reached her seconds before the horses would have, tackling her out of their path. They rolled to safety as the team crashed past, leaving only dust and panic in their wake. Zane found himself hovering over her, one arm braced beside her head. Her hat had come loose, golden hair spilling across the dirt road like sunshine. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear. Faith blinked up at him, breathless but remarkably composed. "Only my dignity, I think." Her eyes searched his. "You saved me." He helped her to her feet, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. "You did." She brushed dirt from her skirt, then looked at his abandoned supplies now scattered across the street. "Oh dear, your provisions." Zane shrugged. "They'll keep." "Let me thank you properly," she insisted. "The school board provided a small house. It's not much, but I could offer you dinner. Tonight." Every instinct warned him to refuse, to retreat to his solitary existence. Yet he heard himself say, "I'd be obliged, Miss Harrington." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Faith, please. I believe saving a lady from being trampled earns you the right to use her given name." That evening, Zane found himself sitting at a small table in Faith's neat little house at the edge of town. The meal was simple, rabbit stew and biscuits, but prepared with care. More surprising than the food was the conversation. Faith spoke of Boston, of her family's dismay at her decision to teach in the frontier, of books and ideas he'd never encountered. "Why the Colorado Territory?" he asked as she poured coffee. "Seems a long way from Boston finishing schools." Faith's expression grew serious. "After the war, everything changed. My father and brothers didn't return." She stirred her coffee slowly. Society had very specific ideas about what an unmarried woman of 23 should do. Find a husband, preferably one wealthy enough to ease the family's reduced circumstances. Her voice took on a hint of steel. "I decided my life would be my own." "So you came to the wildest place you could find?" Zane couldn't hide his skepticism. "I came to a place where I might make a difference," she corrected. "Where I could build something meaningful without the weight of everyone's expectations." Zane recognized the determination in her voice. It was the same that had driven him to stake his claim on lonely acres far from town. "What about you, Mr. Sutton? What brought you to Timber Creek?" He stared into his coffee. "War changes a man. Some things you can't unsee. And some burdens are lighter when shared," she said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and Zane felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in the wall he'd built around himself. As he rode home under stars bright enough to hurt, Zane fought the unsettling realization that Faith Harrington had seen straight through him. More disturbing still was how much he wanted to let her. Over the next month, Zane found reasons to come to town twice weekly. Sometimes he would happen by the schoolhouse as children poured out at day's end. Other times, he'd appear at Faith's door with fresh venison or trout, claiming he had extra. She accepted these offerings with knowing smiles that made him both uncomfortable and exhilarated. They established a routine. He would bring game or fish, and she would cook dinner. Afterward, they would sit on her small porch as twilight settled over the mountains. Faith would read aloud sometimes, poetry and novels he'd never encountered. Zane found himself looking forward to these evenings with an intensity that frightened him. One evening in late summer, Faith closed her book and asked, "Will you show me your homestead someday?" The question startled him. His land was his sanctuary, his alone. "It's nothing special," he deflected. "Just a rough cabin and some fenced pasture." "It's your home," she said simply. "I'd like to see it." The thought of Faith in his private space was both tantalizing and terrifying. Maybe someday, he conceded. That someday came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Faith appeared at his cabin door, riding a gentle mare and wearing a divided riding skirt that made Zane's mouth go dry. "Miss Harrington," he managed, stepping outside. "What brings you all this way?" "Since the mountain wouldn't come to Muhammad," she replied with a mischievous smile. "Besides, it's Saturday. No school." Despite his initial discomfort, Zane found himself proudly showing her the improvements he'd made. The creek he'd dammed to create a small pond, the vegetable garden, the sturdy corral where he kept his 2 horses, and the beginnings of what he hoped would become a respectable herd. "You've created something beautiful here," Faith said, standing at the edge of his property where the land overlooked the valley below. Something that could grow. It's enough for one man, he replied. Faith turned to him, the setting sun illuminating her profile. Is that all you want it to be? Before he could answer, the peaceful moment shattered. A gunshot cracked through the evening air, and Faith cried out, falling to one knee. Blood blossomed on her skirt just above her ankle. Zane reacted instantly, pulling her down behind a boulder as another shot splintered the tree where they'd been standing. Drawing his revolver, he scanned the tree line. Rustlers, he growled. Been hitting ranches up and down the valley. Faith's face was pale but composed as she pressed her handkerchief against the wound. It appears to have just grazed me. Stay down, he ordered, then fired 2 shots toward the ridge where he'd spotted movement. The answering gunfire confirmed his suspicions, at least 3 men. Too many to fight, especially with Faith injured. We need to get to the cabin, he said, calculating the distance. 50 yards of open ground. Faith nodded, her jaw set against the pane. I can make it. Not on that leg. Before she could protest, Zane holstered his gun and lifted her into his arms. Hold tight. He ran, zigzagging toward the cabin as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Faith clung to his neck, her face pressed against his chest. They crashed through the door, and Zane set her on his bed before grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. Bolt the door behind me, he instructed. Faith caught his arm. You're not going out there alone. This is my land, he said, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in his voice. And they shot you. Her hand tightened. Zane, please. Don't risk your life for pride. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and it stopped him cold. The way she said it, soft but urgent, made him realize how much he needed to hear it again. Not pride, he said quietly. But I won't let them drive us out. I'll just scare them off. From the window, he fired strategic shots at the ridge, not aiming to hit, but to pin the rustlers down. After several exchanges, the return fire ceased. Zane waited, tense, but the silence stretched on. Finally, he heard horses galloping away. When he was certain the danger had passed, he turned his attention to Faith. The bullet had indeed only grazed her, but the wound needed cleaning. As he gently washed away the blood, their eyes met. I'm sorry, he said. I never should have let you come here. Don't, she replied firmly. This is not your fault. And I'm glad I came. She touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. You called this place enough for one man, but you didn't hesitate to protect us both. There's room in your heart for more than solitude, Zane Sutton. Something in her words unlocked the final chamber of his resistance. He took her hand in his, pressing it more firmly to his face. I've been alone since Shiloh, he confessed, the words tumbling out after years of silence. Watched my best friends die around me. Promised myself I'd never care that much for anyone again. Faith leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. And how is that promise working for you? Terribly, he admitted, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. I find myself thinking of a certain schoolteacher at the most inconvenient times. How inconvenient, she murmured, her face now inches from his. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the same breath. When they parted, Zane felt as though he'd crossed a frontier more significant than any physical boundary. You should rest, he said, reluctant to break the moment but concerned for her injury. I'll make up a pallet for myself by the fire. Faith nodded, though her eyes held promises that made his heart race. We have time, she assured him. Or so they thought. The rustlers returned 3 nights later, not to steal cattle but for revenge. Zane awoke to the smell of smoke and the crackling of flames. They'd set fire to his barn. He raced outside in his long johns, frantically working to free the horses and the 2 cows he'd purchased just the week before. As he led the last animal to safety, a bullet splintered the post beside his head. Sutton, a voice called from the darkness. This is just the beginning. Your little homestead ain't worth dying for. Zane dove for cover behind the water trough. He'd left his rifle inside, and his revolver was still hanging on the bedpost. Unarmed and exposed, he calculated his chances of reaching the cabin. A figure appeared at the cabin door, Faith, with his rifle in her hands. She fired a warning shot into the air. The next one won't be a warning, she called out, her voice carrying surprising authority. Zane used the distraction to sprint to the cabin, ducking inside as another bullet whizzed past. Faith handed him the rifle, her eyes wide but determined. There's at least 4 of them, she whispered. Zane nodded, quickly formulating a plan. We can hold them off until morning. Sheriff Miller's deputy was riding through the valley today. He'll see the smoke. They defended the cabin through the night, taking turns watching and sleeping. By dawn, the attackers had withdrawn, leaving behind the smoldering remains of Zane's barn and fences. As they surveyed the damage in the early morning light, Faith slipped her hand into his. We'll rebuild, she said. The simple we shook him more profoundly than the attack. Faith, this isn't your fight. She turned to face him, sunrise painting her hair with fire. Isn't it? You saved my life. I saved yours. I think that makes us something to each other. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached. Deputy Carson arrived with 3 townsmen, alerted by the smoke visible for miles. Sutton, Miss Harrington. The deputy's confusion at finding the schoolteacher at Zane's homestead was evident. What happened here? As Zane explained about the rustlers, he noticed the speculative glances exchanged by the townsmen. Faith's reputation would suffer from having spent the night at his cabin, regardless of the circumstances. When the men left to track the rustlers, Zane turned to Faith with a heavy heart. You should return to town, he said. This will cause talk. Let them talk, she replied with surprising fierceness. You don't understand. Your position, I understand perfectly. Her chin lifted. I came west to live by my own choices, not to bow to the same narrow conventions I left behind in Boston. Zane ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Faith, these people respect you. They trust you with their children. I won't be the reason you lose that. And what would you suggest? Her voice had grown dangerously quiet. He looked around at his damaged homestead, then back at the woman who had somehow become essential to him in just a few months. We should stop seeing each other, at least until this blows over. The hurt in her eyes was like a physical blow. I see, she said formally. If that's what you think best. She allowed him to help her onto her horse, her back straight and proud. As she rode away, Zane felt as though he was tearing out his own heart and watching it leave. October came with early frosts and the news that the rustlers had been captured near Denver. Zane had rebuilt his barn and repaired his fences, working from dawn until well past dusk to exhaust himself into dreamless sleep. He had stayed away from town, having supplies delivered by Jenkins's son. Each time, he nearly asked about Faith but stopped himself. Better to cauterize the wound completely. When the first snow dusted the mountains, Zane received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Miller rode up one evening, looking uncomfortable in the saddle as always. Sutton, he greeted. Got something you should know about. Zane invited him in for coffee, dreading whatever news had brought the lawman to his door. Those rustlers we caught? They weren't just any gang. Miller warmed his hands around the coffee mug. They work for Edmund Garrett. The name hit Zane like a punch. Garrett was a cattle baron from Wyoming who'd been pushing smaller ranchers out, legally or otherwise, for years. What's Garrett want with my little spread? Zane asked. Miller sipped his coffee. Not just yours. He's buying up water rights all through the valley. Your creek feeds into the river that waters half the county. I won't sell, Zane said flatly. Figured as much. Miller set down his cup. There's something else. Miss Harrington received a letter yesterday. Offered her a teaching position back east. Very prestigious school, from what I hear. Zane felt the floor shift beneath him. Is she taking it? Don't know, but word is she's considering it. Miller stood to leave. Thought you should know. After the sheriff left, Zane sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The thought of Faith leaving squeezed his chest until he could hardly breathe. But wasn't this what he wanted? She deserved better than a hardscrabble existence with a man haunted by war. Better than the danger his land had brought to her doorstep. A week passed, and the pain of losing her only intensified. On a crisp November morning, Zane saddled his horse and rode into town. The schoolhouse sat quiet and empty Saturday again. Zane continued to Faith's small house, rehearsing words that kept slipping away like smoke. He tied his horse at her gate, removed his hat, and knocked. Long moments passed with no answer. He was about to turn away when the door opened. Faith stood there in a blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and remote as the mountains. Mr. Sutton, she said coolly. This is a surprise. May I come in? He asked, the rehearsed speech abandoning him completely. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The house was different. Books packed in crates, trunks standing ready. You're leaving, he said, his voice hollow. Yes. She folded her hands before her. I've been offered a position at the Cambridge School for Girls. Zane turned his hat in his hands. Is it because of what happened? The talk? No. Her voice softened slightly. The school board has been nothing but supportive. The children and parents as well. Then why? Faith's composure faltered. Why stay? You made it clear there was no future for us. And you were right about one thing. I did come west to make my own choices. She gestured to the packed crates. This is my choice. Faith. He stepped toward her, stopping when she backed away. I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. From what? She asked. From this. He gestured between them. From feeling something that could break me if I lost it. Lost you. He took a deep breath. The war taught me that loving people means risking unbearable pain. So I decided not to love anyone. Faith's eyes glistened. And now I know there are worse pains than loss. Like watching you walk away and doing nothing to stop it. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. I rebuilt my barn. I can rebuild fences. But what we have, I can't replace that. Don't go to Cambridge. Give me one good reason to stay, she whispered. Because I love you. Because my land, my life, none of it means anything without you in it. He drew her closer. Because the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, something in me recognized something in you. Like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. Faith's tears spilled over. I love you too, you impossible man. Their kiss was different this time. Desperate, certain, a promise sealed without words. When they finally parted, Zane rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Not because of talk or propriety, but because I want to build something with you. A home, a family, a life. Yes, she said simply. Edmund Garrett made his move a week before the wedding. He arrived in Timber Creek with lawyers and armed men, presenting documents claiming rights to the watershed that included Zane's Creek. The territory court has ruled in my favor, Sutton, Garrett said, a tall man with cold eyes and expensive clothes. You can sell to me now for a fair price, or I'll dam the creek above your property and you'll watch your land dry up by summer. The confrontation took place outside the general store, with half the town watching. Faith stood beside Zane, her hand in his. Your documents are impressive, Zane replied calmly. But they're based on survey maps from 1865. The territorial governor issued new surveys last year. He nodded to Sheriff Miller, who produced official-looking papers. According to these, the watershed begins on federal land. The creek passes through my property, but I don't own the water. Nobody does. Garrett's face darkened. This isn't over, Sutton. One way or another, I'll have this valley. No, you won't, came a new voice. Judge Hamilton, who had arrived to perform Zane and Faith's wedding, stepped forward. I've just come from Denver, where the territorial legislature has passed a new water rights law. No single entity can control access to waterways that serve multiple communities. Garrett's lawyers huddled, speaking in urgent whispers. Finally, Garrett turned on his heel. You've won this round, Sutton. Enjoy it while you can. As Garrett and his men rode out of town, Faith squeezed Zane's hand. That was rather anticlimactic, she observed. The best victories usually are, Judge Hamilton said with a wink. The wedding took place as planned. In the small church with wildflowers, Faith's students had gathered, decorating every surface. Zane, clean-shaven and wearing a new suit, watched in wonder as Faith walked toward him in a simple white dress, her honey-blonde hair crowned with a wreath of mountain blossoms. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with deeply personal meaning. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, the cheers from the assembled townspeople nearly raised the church roof. The celebration continued at the newly completed Timber Creek Town Hall, with food, music, and dancing that lasted well into the night. As Zane held his wife close during a waltz, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. What are you thinking, husband? Faith asked, her eyes bright with happiness. That I was a fool to think being alone made me strong, he replied, and that I'm the luckiest man in the Colorado Territory. Their homecoming to the ranch brought one final surprise. During their 2-day honeymoon in Denver, the townspeople had been busy. Zane's cabin had been expanded with a new room, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch wrapped around 2 sides. A hand-carved sign hung above the door. Sutton Ranch, AST 1873. Welcome home, Mrs. Sutton, Zane said, lifting Faith into his arms to carry her across the threshold. She laughed, a sound that filled the cabin with warmth. "Our home," she corrected. "The one we'll build together." Spring 1875. Zane stood on the porch, watching Faith in the garden, their 10-month-old daughter asleep in a basket nearby. The past 2 years had brought changes he could never have imagined that day the stagecoach arrived. The ranch had prospered. With Faith's careful bookkeeping and his hard work, they'd expanded to 300 acres and a growing herd. They'd weathered Garrett's continued legal challenges, but with the support of neighbors and the new territorial laws, their water rights remained secure. Faith had continued teaching until little Emma was born, and now held reading classes for adults in their home 3 evenings a week. The community that Zane had once avoided had become an extended family. Faith looked up, catching his gaze. She smiled and beckoned him over, her free hand resting on the gentle swell of their second child. As he crossed the yard to his family, Zane thought of the man he'd been, convinced that the frontier was too harsh for love, that vulnerability was weakness, that isolation was safety. How wrong he'd been. "What has you looking so philosophical?" Faith asked as he knelt beside her. "Just thinking about how things change," he replied, placing his hand over hers. "How people change." She leaned forward to kiss him, soil-smudged fingers leaving a trace of dirt on his cheek. "For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better." Zane glanced at their sleeping daughter, then back at his wife. "Remember what I whispered when you stepped off that stagecoach?" Faith's eyes danced with memory. "Something presumptuous about me being yours, as I recall." He laughed, pulling her gently into his arms. "I had it backward. From that first moment, I was yours." And as they sat together in the garden they'd planted, surrounded by the life they'd built, the frontier didn't seem harsh at all. It seemed like exactly where they were meant to be, together.